When I first started doing these presentations, I didn't have to wear glasses in order to see these things, but now I'm at the point where I have to do this. There we go. Okay, my talk is going to be fairly brief, and one of the reasons is you've heard a lot of what I'm going to talk about from these wonderful people who've spoken to you. Also, a lot of what I'm going to tell you is really intuitive. You've done this job for a long time. You know these things, but sometimes we forget as we're writing the protocols. One of the things that I thought was very interesting is when I used to write protocols, my first one I wrote in 1987, my last one I wrote in 2001. I don't think I wrote a single protocol that didn't have at least one amendment. I don't want to admit this, but I think I had one that had at least 6. Yeah, that wasn't a very good one. Having said that, I'm sure many of us have had that same issue. Did you know that 60% of all protocols today have at least one amendment? And of those, it's on average 2.3 to 3.5% of trial. Okay, we all know this. This is nothing new, not rocket science. The thing that is interesting is that there are some things you cannot control for. You cannot control if there's some safety parameters that need to be reassessed. Can't do. You can't change ECRB's requirements to make changes, etc. But there are things you can, and the bottom 3 things right there is what this presentation is all about. The inclusion-exclusion criteria, the design flaws, and when I say design flaws, we're really talking about bringing in patients at strange intervals, or things that can be corrected. And then one of the things I also found interesting is that of the times that we write an amendment, 40% occur before you've even dosed the first patient. This is the money shot here. Did you know it costs almost $500,000 to get that amendment from start to finish? I don't know about you, but when I was writing these amendments and having to go back to my management and said, please, sir, may I have some more money? How many times did they say no? Or give you a lot of trouble. You shouldn't be having all these amendments. The protocol should be better. This is a problem. So that's a big deal. If the amendments were done better, if you had the information up front, especially with the patient ones, the things that are correctable, think of the money that could be saved. So spending a little bit of money up front to get the research versus spending it at the end to get the amendments, it seems a no-brainer. Again, I already mentioned that 1/3 of the amendments are actually avoidable. So it all goes down to this. It's understanding the patient, it's understanding the disease. And there are multiple places that you can get this information. Again, lovely patients that are very willing to provide you information. Also from the sites, they have a wealth of information. This is what they do every day. So I'm just going to give you a little story. In 2000, I took over a failing pediatric hypertension study. It had been running for 18 months. They had enrolled 6 patients. When I looked at the inclusion-exclusion criteria, it was written beautifully had they placed the study in the VA system and looked for men over the age of 55, because they were looking for essential hypertension. In the pediatric population back in 2000, today it's a little bit different. In 2000, it was all basically secondary hypertension. 80 to 90% was secondary, but they had excluded all of the diseases of secondary hypertension. And when I went back to the medics and I went back to the physicians doing the study, I said, is there a specific reason not to give an ACE inhibitor to these kids? And everybody's like, well, we've always written this into our protocols. But is there a reason not to give this to the kids? Is there any medical valid reason? I've done the studies in this drug in adults. We've given it to renal transplant patients. We've given it to these other secondary forms. Well, we got a consensus it would be safe. Within 6 months, fully enrolled. It led to a supplemental NDA. So it's a matter of really understanding these patients. First question that one should always ask when you're looking at your trials, does the patient exist? And we're not running studies for trials that don't, because we want to eventually sell the drug. Michael spoke about this trial earlier. This was one of my studies that I was running at Clariness, where the patient population was endometriosis. Patients had to have a diagnosis within 10 years using a surgical procedure. Well, fairly common, you would think fairly common and fairly run-of-the-mill. As it turns out, if you look at the graph, which is a little bit small here, when we look at the US and Canada, in Canada, 79% of the patients were diagnosed with endometriosis, but did not have a LAP. US, not much better, 69%. So these patients had a diagnosis. They were being treated for it, but not with the, quote, gold standard diagnosis. So sometimes there's a disconnect between what is clinically and medically used as a diagnosis. It also shows you that there is a significant difference by countries. So when you're looking at your allocations and deciding what countries to put the trials in, it may or may not be a good country. Just another one, this was for a study in Alzheimer's disease. When I worked at ASI, they were just launching Aricept at that time. It was considered one of the gold standard drugs for patients. 15 years later, other drugs have come on market, but it was still considered the gold standard that patients were on as the background medication. Well, not really, because when we looked at the patient population, only 32% of them were at that time still taking donepezil. They had moved on. The physicians were now prescribing other medications. And the interesting thing, because this is a vulnerable population, patients with Alzheimer's, the patients and the caregivers did not want to switch to another medication because they knew what they were taking was working and the side effects were either benign or acceptable, and they were afraid to move to another medication. So that's something to keep in mind. What are you giving as a background therapy, and are patients willing to switch to it? This is another one that's also interesting. AXPA is a fairly new term. Ankylosing spondylitis is not. It's a arthritis, inflammatory arthritis that occurs in the spine and the pelvis. But AXPA, which is a preliminary disease, a pro disease, where you do not have radiological changes yet, but there are other things that will lead to the diagnosis. When we looked at the criteria, so patients had to have it for less than 5 years. So this was not so bad. We lost about 75% of patients because they had it more than 5 years. Okay, not too bad. But when we look at those patients taking a TNF inhibitor, now this is one of the drugs after they fail on the NSAIDs that they go to the next level drug. There's a major difference between each country here. And if you look, the protocol said that they could be on no more than one TNF, and they should have failed that one. Okay. If you look at Hungary, almost 60% of the patients were already on their second one. So when you're talking allocations of studies, Hungary is probably not the place to go. The US, on the other hand, the majority were still on their first one. So again, the point there is really understanding what is standard of care for the patient population as a whole, but also by country, because that will have a significant effect. I put this one up because this was just an interesting one. This is a study where they're looking at a medication to treat patients after they've run a marathon who get infections, so like they get colds or viruses or from the stress of running. So if you think that you've ever had a really bad inclusion-exclusion criteria, look at this one. They have to have signed up for a specific marathon in 2016. They must have successfully completed 2 previous marathons within the past 5 years, and their time to complete those 2 marathons were between 3 and 5.5 hours. Now, it's funny, our CEO actually qualifies for this study. Because I told him, I said, you know, this would never be. He said, well, I'm signed up for the marathon this year. I'm going to that one, and I've met the other criteria. So we have a volunteer. But that's only one of very few, because we've only have 25% of the patients who came through who met all 3 criteria. So this would be a study that you really want to have a good understanding of what your patient population is, because it's not your standard one. It's not hypertension. It's not diabetes. It's a really strange population that we're probably not all that aware of. From the patient's perspective, they have a different understanding than what we do in the medical field. So for example, if we just look at congestive heart failure patients. Now, every single protocol I ever wrote in congestive heart failure always had class 3 to 4 congestive heart failure patients as the inclusion. Great, I know what that means, the physician knows what that means. Patients, not so much. So if you're asking patients in any type of advertisement, do you have class 1, class 2 congestive heart failure, they probably don't know. Some do, but most don't. One of the more interesting things is they don't even call the disease the same name, which again is to me fascinating. In Australia, no, I'm sorry, New Zealand. In New Zealand, 0% of the patients knew the term congestive heart failure. So if you're doing advertising or if you're finding patients who have congestive heart failure, in New Zealand, not going to work. In the US, it was a much higher number. I think it was about 40 or 50%. But again, looking just at the terms here, it's very varied terms that they know. So really understand how does the patient understand their disease, because that's going to be very, very helpful. I made this little funnel because, okay, so they don't have this inclusion, exclusion. The inclusion criteria in my protocol are not that hard. Now again, like I said, I wrote my first protocol in 1987. The inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria is maybe 2 or 3 pages long, if that. And going back to the gentleman who said his informed consent was 1 page versus, I think it was over here, said that their informed consent was much longer. I know between 87 and 2001, the informed consent went from literally a 1 page to, I think, 12 pages was the last one I wrote. So if we look at 1,000 patients who report that they have bladder pain, the protocol criteria is 18 to 60. Well, that's 60% of the patients who we surveyed. So you lose already up at the top about 400 people. The next level step was you have been diagnosed with pain. So it's not that just you have bladder pain, but you actually have a diagnosis of bladder pain. Well, 70% have that. That's great, but that's another 30% that comes out of that funnel. Pain duration, less than 5 years. 65, what did I have, 65? 65% said yes, but look at the number going down again. And finally, not treated with opioids. Okay, 71% are not taking opioids. Great, but look what happened to that number. So that 1,000 patient pool at the top, you're already down to 194, and we haven't added the 50 other inclusion and exclusion criteria to this list yet. So you really have to understand, how does each criteria affect your funnel of potential patients? And there was someone in the team here who said that they had wanted to be in a study but couldn't because they didn't meet the inclusion exclusion criteria. So you have patients who want to be there, but they can't meet this really difficult list of criteria. How do we move patients' trials and clinical trials to make them much more patient-centric? So a couple of different ways. So really understanding the patient population before you even start writing the protocol. And as you're developing the inclusion criteria, one of the easiest ways is just to survey patients. Patients are very happy and willing to tell you about their disease. So just as an example, I ran a psoriatic arthritis survey recently. Within 10 days, we had 2,000 patients respond and give us information about their disease. It was in, I think that's 15 countries, I didn't count the number. You can see that the majority of surveys per country were already completed within 6 days. We had given 14 days. The US was a laggard only because we wanted so many additional surveys from the US, but still well within the time. I want to point out, this was done with no compensation whatsoever. We didn't say, complete the survey and you'll be put into a raffle for a free iPod. There was nothing that we gave them. They just came, filled out our survey. So they're very willing to do this. The other interesting thing is this is Osteogenesis Imperfecta. So this is a more rare disease. This is pediatric population in general that we were dealing with. Number of countries, 65% on average. And it's a little bit skewed because the US had so many more patients than the other countries. But on average, the majority of parents gave us their contact details, so their names, their phone numbers, and their email addresses, and said, let me know when you know about a trial. So there was, again, discussions earlier, how do I find out about these trials? So in this case, we're actually able to send them an email that says, hey, we learned about a new study, here it is. This was an HPV vaccine survey. This was done in Germany. About 1,800 teenagers and about 700 parents answered the survey questions about an HPV vaccine. You can see there's a significant difference. First of all, these are kids who were 13 to 18 years of age, so you can even target children to answer surveys. The important thing here is that there are different motivations. So if you look at just look at the girls, okay? Teen girls, which is the second set of graphs. The ones who said that they would or would not consider an HPV vaccine, just about 15% said that they would not. Look at the parents of daughters. Over 40% said they would not consider a vaccine for their kids. I find that fascinating myself, that the kids are willing to do this even. And so you may, when you're doing your informed consents, when the physicians are discussing these trials, especially pediatrics, you need to talk to both, and you need to get a discussion between the parent and the child and get them to communicate together and make an agreement. This one was for Alzheimer's disease study. And again, understanding the disease, and the responses are going to be very different based on the severity of the disease. So early in the disease, as one would expect, it's the patients seeking information. As you get later on in the disease, the caregivers are really now the ones that you're going to be talking to. And in that study that I showed you earlier on Alzheimer's, it was very interesting. Again, that was mild to moderate. 50% of the people who responded to our online advertising for a clinical trial were the patients, 50% were the caregivers. So, patients, even with a disease like Alzheimer's, are still very active in wanting information and wanting to learn about a clinical study. Some of the information that we got back from some of the surveys, although this one was from the Psoriatic Arthritis survey, it applies across the board. We get similar results. And some of the things we already spoke about. I think there was someone here who has a site that they use weekend hours for patients. Well, weekend hours, 50% of people who said, I would be much more likely to participate in a study if I can come on the weekends. Thinking about your population. Is it a younger population? Are they working? They don't want to lose time from work. So can you accommodate them? About 50% again, if you had hours at the end of the day, they'd be much more likely to be in the study. Some services provided. Parking near the office. Now you'd say, well, what's the big deal on that? 72%, a significant number, said, if you could give me parking nearby. And just as an aside, my mother has been undergoing cancer therapy for the past couple of months. And one of the best things about the center that she goes to, valet parking. There's a guy who's waiting at the door. He takes my mom's car, parks it. When she comes back, gives it back, no charge. Now, again, you're saying, well, that's a tiny little, but to my mom, who's 84 years old, having chemo and radiation, it's a big deal. And she doesn't have to walk so far. She doesn't have to worry, where's my car? It's all done for her. So it's little perks, big results. Meal vouchers. If you have a long day schedule, patients want something to, a meal during the day. You have some of these tests that run 4, 5, 6 hours. Have meals available. Again, going back to my mom's chemotherapy, they have a countertop full of food. So they have, for breakfast, they have little muffins and fruits, and lunchtime they have little sandwiches. Transportation provided. Again, big thing here. Now, there was recently an article about how Uber and Lyft are partnering to help clinical trial patients get to sites. Imagine if a Lyft or an Uber came to your house, picked you up, brought you to the site. Now, you don't have to worry anything about paying, because that's all done through the site, because they've ordered the Uber for you. I mean, patients who were thinking about doing a study, would that be helpful, as opposed to having to worry?
It's hard to get around.
Right? So again, something to consider. There's new technologies, there's new ways of doing things. Be open to thinking about new possibilities. This one doesn't surprise me because, again, going back to my mom, she always asks to see Linda, the nurse at the chemo center. She doesn't want anybody else touching her. She wants Linda. Patients want to see the same person every time they go. They want us to receive education with you. I think you heard that loud and clear. I don't need to go any further. And they also would like help remembering about the study. What are my visits? Is there anything special that I need to know about the upcoming visit, that it's going to be a longer day than normal? Another way to get information, again, this was all patient-facing information that we just looked at. Sites. Sites have a wealth of information on their own. And you can easily survey sites. You can do feasibility with sites. Now, this is not the general feasibility that you would do, looking to see, do they have a ultracentrifuge, or they have a -30 fridge. This is not that type of, but rather, do they have the patients? And by gaining patient insights from the centers, you'll already learn that the populations exist at those centers, they exist in that country, what the number of patients and what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are going to be affecting your trial. Later on, that affects recruitment, and it affects retention as well. And just to give a little bit more detail, so again, these are real-world insights about your patients from the sites, because this is who's going to be seeing your patients. They can validate the protocol. So, by answering just a few simple questions, they can say, yes, I have this patient who has this disease, who has this, and you can already see that you can find patients. Helps you with the country selection, as I showed you with Hungary. If you're looking for patients who are not taking 2 TNF drugs, Hungary's not where to go. But the sites would have already told you that, because they would have said, in my patient population, at my practice, I am giving patients 2, I'm already up to 3 TNFs. And again, one of the interesting things in the byproduct for site selection, if the sites won't fill this out, they probably aren't going to do too well in your study. Because they're already, this is work, this is extra, I'm not going to do this. In addition, again, going back to some data that I have from the past, about 20% of sites will never enroll a single patient. So I told you almost $500,000 on a protocol amendment. Well, how much are you spending to initiate a site? So from the time you make first contact to the time they're ready to enroll their first patient. I have numbers that date back to 2007. At that time, it was $30,000 per site. So if you have 100 sites, 20% are not enrolling, you do the math. So wouldn't it be nice to know up front, do they have the patients, and are they going to work? This was done in tinnitus. For those who don't know, it's that ringing in the ears. I have it. It's really annoying. The problem was we wanted to really make sure that the patients were out there who met the criteria. We wanted to also look to see what the enrollment potential was at each of the sites that the sponsor wanted to use. So we did the survey using a feasibility tool of patients that they have. 30 centers completed 300 patients in just 1 month. So already you know that you have enough patients at these 30 centers to fill your protocol. In addition, the sites that did the best in filling out the feasibility also were the best enrollers. So there was definitely a correlation between the two. So wouldn't it be, again, nice to know up front which sites are going to be your good enrollers. And when looking, we did ask the patients at the end about whether or not they thought that this was a good thing to do with, were they happy filling it out? We had 90% of them saying yes, they really, they felt that this was not a problem to do and they were happy to do it. So just a summary. Again, patients want to be part of the healthcare equation. They want information. We have lots of information. Share. And when you share information, I think this will be discussed later, share in a language that they understand. Okay, that's critical. The sites, again, they have a lot of input. For the most part, you're not selecting sites who've never done a clinical study before. They can give you a wealth of information as well. Use it. Use it to your advantage. Really get a good understanding of what the standard of care is in the countries. So again, when I first started doing clinical trials in hypertension, there were very few drugs on the market. It's before the ACE inhibitors, it's before the ARBs, it's before anything new that I don't even know about. You basically just had beta blockers and thiazides, and that was, so it was pretty easy, and the inclusion and exclusion list was pretty small. If they're doing my beta blocker study, they can't be on thiazides. But now, with all the drugs, but you know what? Not all drugs are approved in all countries. Someone had said here earlier about the study drug that they were not approved in the US, fine, but it was approved in France. So you need to know that is how is that going to affect your study? And surveys and feasibility tools are very easy to do. They're very quick, and yet they provide so much information. All right, I give it back to Catherine. Thank you so much for listening.